I was sipping my morning coffee when I noticed something odd from my porch window. At first glance, it looked like steam coming off my tomato patch, but then I saw it. Chlorinated water, murky with pool scum, was gushing like a mini waterfall through the fence crack from Karen's backyard and flooding straight into mine. My once green garden was turning into a suburban swamp. My scarecrow slumped sideways like he'd just given up. I ran out in my slippers, slipped in the mud, and came face to face with a floating garden gnome. That's when it hit me. Karen had dumped her entire pool into my yard. Again. And this time, she wasn't getting away with it. 2 weeks earlier, I had just replanted the garden beds. I'd put in heirloom tomatoes, bell peppers, and my prized basil that I babied more than I should admit. My wife called it my therapy. But it wasn't therapy anymore. Not when every other morning I found the soil soggy, leaves turning yellow, and earthworms trying to evacuate. I couldn't figure it out at first. I checked the irrigation system, replaced hoses, and even ran a dye test through the pipe. Everything on my end checked out. But nature doesn't flood uphill. And that's when I caught her. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I came home early from work because the weather was unpredictable, and I didn't trust the forecast. I stepped onto the back deck and heard the unmistakable sound of running water. But it wasn't the sprinklers. It was stronger, steadier. I peeked over the fence, and there she was. Karen, reclining in a lawn chair, phone in one hand, glass of white wine in the other. A hose was running from her pool into the side yard, draining gallons of water directly toward our shared fence. I leaned closer and saw the trench. She had dug a shallow channel that led straight into my yard like she was Moses parting the Red Sea, except instead of freedom, she was delivering mildew and mosquitoes. I called out to her, trying to stay calm. Karen turned, lifted her sunglasses, and gave me the most dismissive smirk I've ever seen. She raised her glass like she was toasting me, then turned the hose up higher. I was too stunned to speak. My mind kept repeating the same sentence like a bad echo. This woman is flooding my yard on purpose. Later that evening, I approached her at the community mailbox. I figured face-to-face might work better. I greeted her and mentioned the runoff. She didn't even flinch. She said, and I quote, "Maybe if your lawn didn't sit so low, you wouldn't have this problem." I stood there, blinking. She actually had the audacity to blame me. I asked her politely to stop draining her pool in that direction. She shrugged and said she'd take it under advisement, then walked away like she'd just won a court case. I went straight to the HOA. I sent photos, videos, even a diagram showing how the elevation slope clearly routed her pool water into my property. The president, Todd, was less than helpful. He said that since there were no visible damages and no standing water at the time of his visit, it was not an urgent matter. Karen had gotten to him first, I realized. She was the queen bee of the HOA circle. Her word carried weight, especially since she hosted wine nights and donated to the neighborhood event. I didn't. I just kept to myself. Now I was starting to see what that had cost me. I tried building a barrier. I went out and bought garden timbers and dug a small trench filled with gravel to redirect the flow. The next day it was gone. Not tampered with, gone. Like someone had taken it apart and removed it piece by piece. I didn't have cameras on that side, but I knew. No one else had reason to interfere. I knocked on Karen's door. No answer. The next morning, I found a note pinned to my mailbox. Fences work both ways. Stay on your side. No signature, but I recognized the handwriting from the annual holiday cards she hand-delivered. At this point, my wife suggested hiring a lawyer. But legal action takes time, money, and patience. I wanted something better. Something immediate and poetic. That night, I sat down with my old blueprints from when I helped with the initial infrastructure layout of the neighborhood. See, I'm not just a homeowner. I'm a retired systems engineer. Water flow, piping, gravity-fed systems. That's my bread and butter. And suddenly, all the frustration clicked into something useful. I saw the layout of the original backyard drainage systems, how runoff flowed naturally toward the east corner. And that corner, by pure chance or twisted fate, lined up directly with the crawlspace beneath Karen's house. That's when the plan was born. I started slow. I didn't want to raise any suspicion. Under the guise of building a new flower bed, I began digging a subtle trench across the back of my yard. Every night, a little more. I used quiet tools, worked only after dark, and covered the area neatly with sod and mulch each morning. My neighbors had no idea. Karen didn't notice. And soon, I had a channel that led directly to the eastern edge of her property line, right up against her foundation. I needed to be sure it would work, though. So, I tested it with my garden hose. I let a slow trickle run through the trench and watched as the water disappeared under her fence line. Hours later, she posted a photo in the HOA group chat. It showed Zeus, her tiny demon chihuahua, barking furiously at a puddle forming near her laundry room door. She wrote, "Anyone else having drainage issues? Must be a city problem." I laughed so hard I nearly fell off my porch swing. Still, I needed confirmation. The next time Karen drained her pool, I didn't stop her. I let her fill my trench. I let the water run where gravity wanted it to go. But I monitored everything from beginning to end. By morning, the far corner of her yard was soaked. Her back patio was damp, and a faint water stain had appeared on the siding by her living room door. I had proof of concept. Now all that was left was to make it permanent. But I wouldn't just reroute the water. I'd amplify it. Using a little mechanical ingenuity, I'd make her own drainage system betray her. I ordered parts anonymously, modified a few old pump timers, and mapped every inch of my yard like I was planning a heist. And I wasn't just going to drain her pool into her own home. I was going to make sure she couldn't trace it back to me. This wasn't petty. This was precision. Because when someone weaponizes water against you, you don't just build a dam. You build a flood. The next phase of my plan began at dawn, the morning after Karen's latest pool purge. I stepped outside with a mug of coffee and examined the ground. Her chlorinated assault had done its job. My garden beds were beyond salvageable, the mulch floated like driftwood, and muddy water still gurgled near the fence line. But something else caught my attention, a faint ripple in the middle of the gravel trench I had built. It was working. The water was flowing exactly where I needed it to, vanishing beneath the layer of rocks I had strategically placed to disguise the entrance to the hidden piping system. I took a deep breath, knelt down, and began Phase 2 of what I was now calling Operation Backflow. That afternoon, I headed to the hardware store and picked up a few necessary pieces: black flexible piping, industrial-grade waterproof sealant, and a few nondescript landscaping tools. I told the clerk I was reinforcing some French drains. He nodded like he understood, probably just glad I wasn't one of those customers asking where the tiki torches were in January. Back home, I waited until dusk, when the neighborhood grew quiet and Karen's lights dimmed. With my headlamp strapped on and gloves pulled tight, I dug carefully around the gravel bed until I revealed the pipe's opening. I extended it further, snaking it slowly beneath the fence using the natural downward slope. The plan was simple. When Karen released water from her pool again, my trench would catch it, redirect it, and instead of it flooding my yard, it would go straight into the sealed runoff channel that ran beside her foundation. That channel, conveniently forgotten over the years, now connected directly beneath the crawlspace under her home. What used to be a protective drain would soon become a silent riverbed feeding into her floorboards. I wasn't going to flood her home just yet. I needed to test the system first, see how water moved through the new path. So I filled a 5-gallon bucket, poured it down the trench slowly, and ran around to her front yard. I pretended to take a casual stroll past her driveway, just in time to see a thin stream of water oozing out from the edge of her garage slab. It worked. Gravity was on my side. My engineering instincts hummed with satisfaction. The next few days I kept a low profile. I didn't want Karen catching on. She was, after all, unpredictable. One moment she was giggling by the pool with her wine glass, the next she was accusing a neighbor of letting their dog telepathically intimidate Zeus. But mostly she kept her attention on planning another one of her Sunday brunches, a rowdy event that brought half the HOA elite to her patio to drink, gossip, and let their kids run wild. I had a feeling she'd want the pool ready for it, which meant another round of draining soon. Sure enough, late Friday afternoon, I heard the familiar hiss of her hose being attached. I peered through a knothole in the fence and saw Karen fiddling with the pool filter and adjusting the outflow line. She pointed the hose once again into the shallow channel she had carved herself, completely unaware that it now led to her own undoing. I didn't stop her. I didn't warn her. I simply watched the water begin to trickle through the trench and disappear under the fence line. Then I walked back to my deck, sat down with a beer, and waited. By midnight it was pouring. Not just from Karen's pool, but from the sky. The local weather had called for light showers, but they got it wrong, completely wrong. Thunder rolled in, and within minutes, the rain was sheeting down like a waterfall. I stepped into my boots, grabbed my flashlight, and went to inspect the trench. It was flowing perfectly. Karen's runoff and the stormwater mixed and surged together like old friends at a reunion, racing toward the pipe and vanishing underground. My trench was the perfect highway, and the exit ramp ended right beneath her living room. I checked my front yard at sunrise. Her driveway was damp, and a dark stain marked the base of her garage. Her sprinklers were off, so it wasn't that. She hadn't even noticed yet. I could see her in the window, yawning with a cup of coffee, oblivious to what lay beneath her floorboards. But I knew it was only a matter of time before the real damage showed. Karen's brunch that Sunday was a full spectacle. White tablecloths, platters of fruit, gallons of mimosa mix, and her Bluetooth speaker blasting what she probably thought was classy jazz but sounded more like circus music. I pretended to work on my hedges just to be nearby. Guests arrived, kids jumped in the pool, and Karen floated on a massive inflatable flamingo like she was royalty. But then the screams started. It began in the living room. Someone had gone inside to use the restroom and stepped into 2 inches of water that had bubbled up from beneath the wood floors. Within minutes, her guests swarmed out of the house. One of them tried to help by opening the back door, but that only let more water pour toward the center of the house. Karen ran inside, shrieking. She tried to salvage her Persian rug, but it was already soaked. Zeus barked nonstop as she screamed at him to be quiet, like the dog had caused it all. I stood calmly on my porch, sipping my drink, watching it unfold. I even turned on my sprinkler to make it look like I was busy with yard work. She wouldn't suspect me. Why would she? I had been the polite, quiet neighbor all this time. The guy who asked nicely. The guy she ignored. By Monday, her driveway was filled with a restoration crews truck. Big fans, wet vacs, plastic sheet. I watched them carry out rolls of ruined carpet, waterlogged furniture, and boxes that sagged with mildew. Karen was outside most of the day, on the phone, yelling at someone, her insurance company, from what I gathered. I overheard phrases like denied claim and neglect of maintenance. I smiled a little. My wife told me not to enjoy it too much, but honestly, it was hard not to. After all the times I had cleaned mud off my patio, after all the wasted plants and rotting mulch, this felt like nature finding its balance. That evening, Karen marched up to the HOA president's house and pounded on the door. She wanted help. She demanded an emergency meeting. She tried to argue that I had somehow funneled the rainwater into her home. But without proof, and with her long-standing reputation of ignoring runoff rules, she got no sympathy. In fact, a few other neighbors started chiming in with their own complaints. The tide was turning against her, and she didn't even realize how isolated she'd become. I stayed quiet. I kept my trench camouflage. I made small talk at the mailbox, waved politely when I saw her, and even offered a hollow hope things dry up soon when we crossed paths. She glared but didn't speak. I could feel her suspicion growing, but she had no evidence. No cameras. No proof. Just karma in liquid form. It wasn't over yet, but the foundation was cracked, literally and metaphorically. And with one more push, I knew I could finish what she started when she dumped that first wave of pool water into my tomatoes. She thought she was above consequences, that no one would stand up to her entitlement. But she forgot the first rule of engineering: every action has a reaction. And I was just getting warmed up. The storm had passed, but the damage it left behind hadn't even started to settle. Karen's front yard looked like a construction zone. The restoration crew came in shifts, working around the clock. Giant industrial fans roared through the open windows, making her elegant home sound more like a loading dock. Buckets, hoses, and dehumidifiers lined her driveway like modern art pieces curated by Mother Nature herself. I watched from my porch with the kind of casual interest one gives to a passing parade. Except this parade had been summoned by her own arrogance, and I had front-row seats to the unraveling. Karen wasn't taking it well. She was on edge, snapping at everyone. Her once polite smiles for the neighbors were gone, replaced by an irritated scowl and oversized sunglasses that failed to hide her frustration. Zeus, her ever-loyal chihuahua, barked at every passing truck, every movement, every shift in the wind. Rumor had it she'd tried to file an insurance claim and was met with a firm denial. The inspector pointed to poor maintenance and water redirection violations, quoting specific clauses in her policy. Of course, she didn't tell anyone that herself. I heard it from Nancy, who overheard it from Gail, who lived 2 houses over and just happened to be gardening when the adjuster's truck pulled up. News travels fast in neighborhoods like ours, especially when someone like Karen is involved. What made it better, funnier, even, was Karen's refusal to accept responsibility. She spun a dozen theories in the group chat. First it was the city sewer line backing up, then it was a freak storm anomaly, then she claimed someone had vandalized her foundation to funnel water in. She even floated the idea that gophers had dug tunnels that redirected runoff. Gophers. And yet, not once did she mention draining her pool. Not once did she acknowledge the garden trench she had proudly dug 2 months prior to save herself the trouble of proper drainage. But despite her chaos, I stayed in the background. I didn't gloat. I didn't poke the bear. I just kept tending to my yard, which was finally dry and recovering. The soil had absorbed most of the mess, and my second round of plantings had started to peek through. With Karen too busy battling indoor flooding, she hadn't dumped another drop of water my way. Peace, it seemed, was returning. Until she called the police on me. It was a Thursday morning. I was outside repairing a raised bed, nothing fancy, just swapping out some warped boards, when a black and white cruiser pulled up in front of my house. I thought maybe it was a routine patrol. Then 2 officers stepped out and walked right toward me. They asked my name, confirmed my address, then politely asked if I'd mind answering a few questions. Karen had filed a complaint alleging property sabotage. Specifically, she claimed I had redirected stormwater into her home on purpose. I tried not to laugh. I asked if she had any evidence. They said she had none but wanted them to document her statement. So I took them around back. I showed them everything. My rain barrel, my gutter guards, my garden drainage beds. Everything up to code. I even offered to show them time-stamped photos from the days before the storm, proving that my yard was already set up for proper water management. One of the officers nodded as he examined the slope and said, "Looks like the water did what water does," followed gravity. I shrugged. They left after 15 minutes, no citations, no follow-up. But Karen wasn't done. That evening, she went on a tirade in the HOA group chat. She accused me of manipulating city systems, called me a neighborhood saboteur, and demanded a formal emergency HOA meeting. She even hinted at legal action. I said nothing. I let her words hang in the chat like the scent of something rotten. Other neighbors, however, weren't as silent. One by one, people began responding. Some gently reminded her that her drainage had been an issue for months. Others brought up past complaints, loud music, lawn violations, trash bins left out for days. Then came the bombshell. A neighbor posted a screenshot of Karen admitting weeks earlier that she drained her pool into her yard because it was easier than calling a guy. It was over. The chat exploded. Karen went silent. 2 days later, the HOA president called for a closed-door meeting, which was really just a polite way of saying, "Let's figure out what to do before this woman gets us all sued." I attended, of course. Not to argue. Just to listen. But when Karen barged in uninvited, demanding explanations and pointing fingers, the room grew cold. People were tired. They were embarrassed. She had gone too far. The president finally said, "We can't keep covering for you, Karen." Her face twisted in disbelief. She ranted about betrayal, about favoritism, about how this whole neighborhood was full of ungrateful freeloaders. Then, for dramatic effect, she tried to storm out, only to slip slightly on the polished floor with her soaked heels squeaking like angry mice. Nobody laughed. But a few of us smiled quietly. After that meeting, everything shifted. Karen no longer strutted down the sidewalks like she owned the block. She kept to herself. Her wine brunches stopped. Zeus barked through closed windows. It felt like the natural order had returned. But I knew her. I knew someone like Karen doesn't just vanish into the shadows. She simmers, and simmers, until something pushes her over again. Sure enough, the next week, I noticed new activity in her yard. She was installing some kind of DIY drainage barrier made from stacked bricks and landscape fabric. I watched as she tried to seal the boundary between our properties like she was fortifying a fortress. I wasn't worried. Her so-called barrier was doomed. Not only was it poorly constructed, but she didn't check with the city or HOA before altering the runoff path. I took a few photos and filed a quiet report online. Nothing aggressive. Just a notification that someone was modifying shared property without approval. 3 days later, a city code inspector arrived. I pretended to be pruning bushes while watching the whole thing unfold. Karen tried to argue with him, explaining it was a temporary structure. He asked for permit. She had none. She claimed emergency repairs. He asked for documentation. She had none. He finally issued a warning and ordered her to remove the structure within 7 days. She fumed, called it harassment, and threatened to contact her lawyer. That night, her lights stayed off. For the first time since she moved in, her house was dark and quiet. I stood on my porch, enjoying the silence, the breeze, the scent of damp earth that didn't reek of chlorine. My wife joined me with a drink, raised her glass, and said, "Do you think it's over?" I looked across at Karen's place, at the faint silhouette of Zeus watching us through the blinds, and replied, "Not yet. But it's close." Because I had one more move to make. Not one of vengeance, not anymore. This wasn't just about me and my garden. It was about everyone Karen had walked over. The neighbors she'd insulted, the complaints she'd ignored, the rules she'd bent for her own gain. I didn't just want her to fix her damage. I wanted her to face consequences that couldn't be mopped up by a crew with fans and hoses. And as I stared out across the fence, watching the remnants of her brick wall already starting to shift from the weight of rain-soaked soil, I knew exactly where the final push would come from. Not with water this time, but with something far more devastating. A unified community, tired of her reign, and ready to pull the plug. It didn't take long for Karen to try clawing back control, as if ignoring the disaster in her living room would somehow make the rest of the neighborhood forget what happened. She reemerged a few days after the city inspector issued her that warning, acting like nothing had changed. She walked her dog in designer boots, waved stiffly at the neighbors she used to scold, and even tried to host a wellness hour in her front yard with scented candles and a yoga mat. Nobody showed up. Not even the other HOA cronies who once sipped wine at her table and whispered about everyone else's lawn lengths. Karen stood there awkwardly in her stretchy pants, Zeus licking up spilled kombucha while she tried to pretend everything was normal. But it wasn't, and she knew it. Her desperation took new shape when I noticed she'd installed sprinkler heads near the fence that lined our properties. They weren't part of her original setup. I would have seen them during my many late-night reconnaissance walks. These were new, positioned deliberately to arch over the boundary and target the edge of my yard. That first evening they activated, they soaked the row of wildflowers I had just planted, almost like it was personal. But I didn't react. Not yet. I simply adjusted my smart irrigation system to do what I'd programmed it for months ago, back when this war began. The sensors kicked in at dawn, and when Karen walked by with Zeus, she got hit with a perfect-timed spray of cold water laced with compost tea runoff. Her scream was muffled by the splashing and the frantic yelps of her soaked dog. I stood by the garden, hose in hand, and waved politely. Later that morning, she marched over to the HOA president's house again, still dripping at the edges, and demanded action. But things had changed. The president wasn't as quick to jump when Karen snapped anymore. He barely opened the door and mumbled something about scheduling a hearing before closing it again. Karen paced on the porch for a while, cursing under her breath, then stomped off toward her house, glaring at every neighbor who looked her way. It was becoming clear she'd lost the power she once wielded so carelessly. The rest of the neighborhood had grown weary of her antics long before the flood, but now they were emboldened. The couple down the street, who she once threatened over a decorative mailbox, had finally had enough. They organized a community group chat separate from the HOA and invited everyone except her. Screenshots from that chat made their way to me, filled with jokes about Karen's water features and memes about Zeus in a life vest. But buried among the jokes were real concerns. People were worried about safety, about how unchecked she had been for too long. A plan began to form, quiet but strong. One of the neighbors, a real estate agent with connections, uncovered that Karen had missed 2 mortgage payments. The speculation was that she was financially strained from the flood repairs, the restoration crew, and the denied insurance claim. Add to that the fines from the city and the collapsing support from the HOA, and she was on the verge of something worse than embarrassment. She was on the verge of losing the house. Rumors swirled that she'd quietly listed it through a pocket listing service, hoping to find a buyer without letting the neighborhood know. But the house still smelled faintly of mildew, and no staging could cover the warped baseboards or the freshly caulked cracks in the foundation. One day, a pair of strangers pulled up and toured the home. Karen greeted them with a fake smile and a clipboard, trying to pass herself off as her own agent. I stood across the street trimming my hedges and made sure to mention, in earshot of the potential buyers, that the last flood was just 3 weeks ago and the neighborhood still wasn't sure if her plumbing had been fixed. They left within 20 minutes. Karen retaliated by filing yet another complaint with the HOA, this time alleging harassment. But this time, no one took her side. The president filed it as unsubstantiated and passed a motion to limit her access to the HOA group chat. When she tried to log in later that night and found herself locked out, she wrote a furious letter and hand-delivered it to everyone's mailbox. Most people tossed it straight into the recycling bin. It was around then that I received a call from the HOA treasurer, an older gentleman named Howard who usually stayed neutral. He asked if I'd consider joining the board. I laughed, assuming it was a joke, but he was serious. He said people respected how I'd handled things. I declined. Quietly managing my own garden was enough responsibility, but I recommended someone else. Marlene, the neighbor with the real estate ties and a calm head. Within a week, she was voted onto the board in a special session. Karen, of course, tried to object, but her protests fell flat when the bylaws were read aloud, showing the community had the right to appoint interim members during emergencies. And this, they argued, was very much an emergency. Karen spiraled further. She tried to rally a group to restore dignity to the neighborhood, but no one joined. She tried to host another event, this time a barbecue. Only 2 people showed up, her cousin and a guy delivering firewood. Zeus barked nonstop, and someone called animal control over the noise. The officer left with a warning slip and a comment about repeat offenders. Karen stood on her porch afterward, muttering to herself, red-faced and furious. Her last stand came in the form of a new construction project. Without permits, she had a contractor, who looked more like a day laborer, start digging trenches along her backyard wall. She was trying to install an above-ground drainage bypass system. It looked like a mad science project, pipes jutting out at weird angles, hoses duct taped together, and a giant blue tarp flapping in the wind. Someone filmed it and uploaded it to the group chat. The caption read, "DIY or die." Within 48 hours, the city returned. They fined her for illegal construction, issued a cease and desist, and mandated she restore the landscape to its original condition. She screamed at the inspector, calling him a drainage tyrant, and threw a shovel into the street. That outburst was caught on a Ring camera. The video circulated faster than wildfire, and the HOA had no choice but to issue a formal reprimand and suspend her voting rights. The last blow came quietly. During a casual conversation, Marlene mentioned to me that the HOA had hired an independent firm to evaluate past complaints and neighborhood safety concerns. The results didn't favor Karen. They found patterns of negligence, multiple rule violations, and an abuse of influence within the HOA board when she held power. The documentation alone was enough to warrant further investigation and possibly open civil liability. Karen got wind of it a few days later and stopped showing her face entirely. One morning, I stepped out to find a for sale sign finally planted in her yard. Not a pocket listing, but a real one, with bold letters. It was over. Karen had lost the war. Not in one blow, but in 100 little moments, each one a consequence of her arrogance, her entitlement, and her refusal to take responsibility for the chaos she created. And as I watered the new rose bushes lining the edge of my garden, I couldn't help but notice how quiet the neighborhood sounded. No barking, no shouting, just the wind in the trees and the soft hum of a place that had, at last, reclaimed its peace. The neighborhood hadn't felt this peaceful in years. With the for sale sign firmly staked into Karen's front yard, it was as if a weight had lifted off the entire block. For the first time in a long while, kids rode their bikes without being yelled at, neighbors waved without suspicion, and the air didn't carry the scent of chlorine from her eternally draining pool. The transformation wasn't just physical, it was emotional. You could see it on people's faces. The tightness in their shoulders was gone. Laughter returned to porches. Conversations bloomed over hedges. Karen had become a ghost before she ever officially left. In the weeks following her decision to sell, Karen withdrew completely. The woman who once paraded down the street in pastel-colored activewear and barked orders like a wannabe general now slinked from her front door to her car with sunglasses too large and a hoodie drawn tight. Zeus had stopped barking, probably too confused by the silence to know what to do with it. The house sat in limbo, half lived in and half forgotten. The lawn grew patchy. Weeds crept through the once manicured flower bed. Even the wind chime she loved so much had been taken down. It was as though the house itself was ready to let go of her. One morning, without fanfare or warning, a moving truck pulled up. It wasn't a large one, more like a mid-sized van meant for someone trying to leave quickly. I saw her carry out boxes herself, unlabeled, battered, shoved hastily into the back. No friends came to help. No HOA members showed up to say goodbye. Just her, Zeus, and a silence so loud it felt like a statement. I stood on my porch, sipping my coffee, not to gloat, but simply to witness the final chapter in a story she had written with her own entitlement. Karen didn't look up once. She loaded the final box, slammed the door shut, and climbed into the front seat. Zeus jumped onto the passenger side and barked twice, then stopped as if he sensed this wasn't the time. The engine started, rumbled low, then pulled away from the curb. No goodbyes. No last words. She turned the corner, and just like that, she was gone. A collective breath seemed to escape from the neighborhood. Curtains fluttered. Garage doors opened. It felt like spring after a brutal winter. Within days, the house was officially listed. The real estate agent in charge, Marlene's colleague, ensured that the listing was honest about the recent repairs, the foundation reinforcement, and the drainage issues. Transparency, she said, would attract serious buyers. And it did. A young couple toured the house within the first week. They didn't mind the history. They liked the layout, saw potential in the space, and weren't intimidated by a little water damage from the past. They were friendly, earnest, and most importantly, not Karen. When they moved in, they introduced themselves with baked goods. Real ones. Homemade lemon bars and banana bread. Not store-bought muffins wrapped in fake humility. They apologized on behalf of their house's former occupant, explaining that even during the walkthrough, the neighbors' warnings were helpful. They asked what plants grew well here, how the trash schedules worked, and if there was a community garden. They even invited people over for a casual backyard meet and greet. No speeches, no dress code, just neighbors getting to know each other again. It was perfect. I finally removed the last pieces of my trench system. With Karen gone, there was no need for the subterranean defenses anymore. I filled the gaps, planted over them with thick patches of wildflowers and ornamental grass. The spot where her redirected pool water had once breached the fence was now a rock garden, peaceful and simple. Every time I watered it, I couldn't help but smirk a little, remembering how this small plot of dirt had brought justice more effectively than any lawsuit could. The new neighbors, Alex and Dana, took a real interest in the HOA, not to dominate it but to make it better. Dana volunteered to help organize the community cleanup day. Alex, an architect, offered to sketch new signage for the park entrance. They asked for suggestions rather than handing out orders. People responded in kind. Even the most skeptical neighbors admitted the block felt different. Lighter. It was proof that one toxic personality can poison a place, but it only takes a little kindness to restore it. The HOA, under Marlene's steady hand, underwent a full review. Bylaws were updated. Drainage responsibilities were clearly outlined. Abuse of authority clauses were added. Anonymous reporting systems were put in place to ensure no one could silence complaints again. The group chat was reset. No more backhanded comments or power plays. Just updates, questions, and the occasional meme about overzealous squirrels. For the first time in a long time, the HOA wasn't a tool for control. It was a resource for support. One afternoon, while cleaning out my garage, I stumbled upon a file folder I had forgotten about. Inside were all the photos I had taken, of the flooded garden beds, the broken mulch line, the hidden trench construction, the water stain creeping up Karen's siding. I flipped through them slowly, each one a timestamp in the war that once consumed my yard. I could have thrown them away. Could have deleted every digital copy. But I didn't. I placed them in a sealed envelope and wrote on the front in pen, just in case. Then came a letter. Not an email, not a text, but an actual handwritten letter in cursive I immediately recognized. Karen. It arrived without a return address, just my name scrawled on the envelope in uneven ink. I opened it carefully. Inside was a single page with 9 words written in hurried, slanted handwriting. You win. I hope you're happy. That was it. No apology. No explanation. Just those 9 words. I read it twice, then folded it back up and walked out to the compost bin. I didn't shred it. I didn't keep it. I just tossed it in, closed the lid, and turned the crank. As it disappeared into the pile of grass clippings and eggshells, I realized I felt no triumph, no lingering anger, no guilt. Just peace. The kind of peace that comes when you've fought back with patience, precision, and just the right amount of petty engineering. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and the sprinklers clicked on in sequence, I sat on the porch beside my wife. She leaned against my shoulder, and we listened to the sound of laughter from the new neighbor's backyard. Someone had set up a projector and was playing a family movie on a sheet pinned to the fence. A few kids ran through the grass, their bare feet thumping against the soft earth that had once been saturated with Karen's chlorinated arrogance. Now it was soft and fertile. It was home again. My wife nudged me and asked, "Do you think she'll ever come back?" I shook my head and replied, "Not unless she wants to learn the hard way again." She laughed, then asked if I ever regretted not going the legal route. I looked at the yard, the neighbors, the steady hum of contentment that had returned to our little corner of the world, and said, "Not even a little." Because in the end, I didn't need a courtroom to win. I just needed a garden, some pipe fittings, and a little help from gravity.